Okay, we're ready to get started with our next presenter. If you could please find a seat. Thank you. Our next presenter is Jim Weatherall from AstraZeneca, and his talk today is entitled Unleashing the Power of AI on R&D, the Potential, the Pitfalls, the Progress. Please welcome Jim Weatherall.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we'll just check. Is that on? Yeah, good. Okay. So yeah, pleasure to be here. And actually the previous session, as well as the talks this morning, were a great setup for what I'm about to talk about. I guess how I can now frame my presentation in the light of that is you'll now see essentially an end-to-end case study of how all this stuff comes together in a single company. At least it's how we're doing it. So I thought you might find that interesting. Let's see. Do I have to point this somewhere in particular? No. Okay, so a bit about me. I don't like talking a lot about myself because my British modesty gets in the way of that, but I do find it, I was chatting with a data scientist I met the other day, and I find people's backgrounds fascinating because we come from all over the place, don't we? So I was originally a particle physicist, and I did lots of other things, and then I usually get the question, how did you end up in pharma? And that's kind of a long story that we can talk about in the lunch break. And I also do lots of other stuff. So I think two things to note. We all tend to come from different places, which is what makes data science kind of fascinating, a big mixture of people. And secondly, I think the world is more porous now. So some of these public appointments and academic appointments I've got, I still maintain today, and they're very much encouraged. Is there a good place to point this? Towards you? If I fire it at you. Are the batteries going? Oh, no, here it is. Okay, so I'm just going to introduce our organization, talk about the approach we've taken to data science and AI, where it can go well, go wrong, some specific examples. So hopefully this will put some flesh on the bones of kind of what we were just talking about, some of the areas where pharma can apply these technologies. And okay, I'll keep doing that. So a bit about the organization. So as was mentioned before, we focus in 3 key therapy areas. You can read them for yourself. And I think perhaps a couple of things to call out that may be unique to AstraZeneca or special about AstraZeneca. Firstly, we're very kind of innovation driven. So we're very much, our sort of company is all about being led by the science, being very R&D centric, and finding innovative ways to discover and develop new medicines and get those medicines to the patients that we need them, who need them. So we're not really recycling stuff, we're very much about inventing new stuff. And along the bottom is a non-exhaustive list of the different ways we have these days of doing that. So as with some other companies, you know, it's not just about small molecule chemical synthesis these days. There's lots of platforms off which we can develop therapeutic medicines, and again, I'm not going to read them out, but you can see them for yourself here, and there's more coming online all the time, you know, DNA engineering, et cetera, et cetera. Lots of different ways we can develop medicines to help patients, and that's very exciting. Some numbers, again, I'll let you read them for yourself, but perhaps to call out the highlights, we do invest an enormous amount of money in R&D, so hopefully that backs up our stance as an R&D science-led organization. We've got a really kind of big pipeline of medicines, which is both exciting and kind of scary at the same time because there's an awful lot to deliver, whether you're trying to apply AI to those programs or not. And in fact, I'll show later how AI might be able to help with that problem of volume and pace. And also, you know, we're very, very scientifically driven, and so, you know, publications and things are the way we try and metric and measure that. So that's a bit about the organization. We're global, so I'm based in the UK. Most of my data science and AI team is also in the US, Sweden, some in Poland, and then there's some of our other R&D locations there as well, with places like China, a huge growth and expansion area for us as an organization and as an R&D group as well. So how have we taken this approach? And the reason why this is a kind of a hot topic is the group that I lead is new this year. So prior to my group as a centre, somebody earlier called it a centre of excellence. I think that's not a bad description, but I'll talk about how we describe it a little bit later. That's a new thing for us in terms of bringing all the threads together in R&D as serving as one place where AI can be coordinated from. So zooming out a bit, I like to kind of take a step back before we get to the specifics. This is a simplified version of the pharma R&D pipeline along the bottom, right, where you're trying to understand diseases, discover drugs, put those drugs through the necessary assays, tests, trials, and then hopefully have them approved and reimbursed, and they get to the patients that so desperately need them. What struck us a few years ago was that we're just generating exponentially more data and more different types of data at every point along this chain. In fact, not just the data that we generate, but the data that we can possibly get access to from the outside world as well, which, as I said before, is becoming more porous. And each of these data types, which this is a woefully inadequate list of, can help us at various points in this chain. So, you know, something like sensors and smart devices is not now limited to, you know, patients self-managing their disease. We're putting them into clinical trials. We're, you know, developing smart laboratories in the preclinical space. So it's bewildering. So the question is, how do you start to get mastery of all of this and make the most out of it? So that was the first thought. The second thought is, well, what are we actually trying to do with all this data? So again, a simplified version of it. You can tell these are some of my slides that I show up the chain to sort of describe to the senior management what we're doing, right? They become almost like cartoons. Anybody else that works in a big organization will be familiar with that. So the way we try and think about it is, so we've got data that's generated from specific types of experiments today, specific modalities, specific data types. Over time, we want to get better at creating intersections between these data types, because we believe there's new science, new hypotheses, new insights to be gained at the intersection of those data sets. And ultimately, to have computers and machines reason over vast quantities of interconnected data and actually suggest those hypotheses to us, so that as human scientists, we can do our jobs more effectively. Note, not to replace the human scientists, to be a digital assistant to the human scientists. And then if we put it all together, it might look something like this, okay? And we're doing some of this now, but this is something of a cartoon. And the reason I show the full picture is my group, this new group we're building this year, has this end-to-end remit. So yes, I have large teams of data scientists that do this stuff, but my boss also expects me to deliver from here on through. So I've got capabilities that relate to data standards, policies, ethics, governance, tools, systems, infrastructure, platforms, working with IT to deliver those, figure out how that links to our external data. So all the AIzable bit, as we're now coming to call it, and the AI bit. So very important, I think, that we have a single group that kind of thinks about this whole problem space end to end, and we'll endeavor to solve that end to end for the organization. A huge problem to tackle. I've already been scooped on this one, so I'll have to find some other phrases that I can use. But again, it's worth looking at again, right? That we do think this is a competitive area. We do think companies like ours will quickly fall behind if we don't adopt AI. But we're very much looking for AI to be a tool to improve the way we work, not to replace our scientists. So what can we do with all this data? We can do many, many things, and some examples are shown here. We heard about genomics this morning from Kyle, and the ability to really understand disease at a very granular, specific level, and therefore we get better at knowing how to develop drugs to treat that disease or engineer that DNA in some way. I'll show you an example later of how we're actually using AI to design medicines, increasing personalization, use of imaging. I'll actually talk less about the clinical and RWE space, which I noticed kind of dominated the discussion before, and that's partly because I think there's a whole bunch of stuff to talk about that's not in the clinical space. And also because of the job I used to do, I spent the last several years at conferences giving presentations like this, and all I talked about was the clinical space. So I'm kind of moving on from that and spreading my wings a bit. And what do we look for these implementations of AI to do? One of two things, pretty simply put. We're either trying to go faster, or we're trying to pick the winners more effectively. Okay? So if we can speed up the time to develop a medicine, to get that medicine to the patients that need it, that's a win. And if we can sort of eradicate the chaff from our pipeline and have a much, we mention of probability of success earlier, if our probabilities of success can be more predictive, more borne out in reality, and just overall higher, so that we know that when we put a medicine into clinical trials, it's much more likely to succeed, that's a win as well. So going faster, picking the winners, getting them to patients more effectively. And this is the framework that we've tried to describe all this to the organization. It's incredibly simple, but we found we had to go down to this level of simplicity to actually get people to understand. Lots of smart people, but they're not necessarily data scientists, or they don't necessarily think the way I do and my leadership team does and my data scientists do. So we had to find a way to describe this to them. And this is the Control, Organize, Insight framework. And I recently added learning and development, not because it makes an acronym word, which is COIL, but because I think it's really, really important. Learning and development is about, the awareness, the sort of capability uplift, the training that we need to do across our organization. But it started off as the Control, Organize, Insight framework. And again, you can read it for yourself. The way we think about this whole area is end to end. You have to get some controls around your data so that you're compliant, so that you can govern it in the right way. And then you have to organize it right through automation, processing pipelines, technologies to make sure it's fit for the insight generation, which is what most people associate with the AI, but we see this as a full stack game. So this has not only been useful in explaining this to our organization, but also structuring our organization and making things really clear what group or what department's doing what. And we've set it all up in what we call a hub and spoke framework. So I said earlier, we don't actually call it a center of excellence. We sort of call it the hub. It's the Data Science and AI Hub. And maybe one of my slogans that didn't get scooped yet is I like to say data science is a team sport. So there's lots of talk today about partnerships and how you have to bring different perspectives to bear. We absolutely acknowledge that data science and AI won't succeed unless it is bringing all those groups together. So the blue blob in the middle, if you like, is our hub. That's my team. And you can see that what we're trying to do is centralize the majority of those control and organize aspects. Hopefully, the reasons for that are obvious. But to spell it out, most companies don't want multiple data standards, multiple tools and systems, multiple platforms, multiple policies, if you can help it, unless there's a really good reason for having that. So there's certain things that it really does make sense to centralize. And then for the insight piece, that's very collaborative. So the groups around the outside, those are our spokes in the hub and spoke model, okay? These might be groups working in particular disease areas, particular therapy areas. They might be doing safety. They're the groups that you heard about before, doing very specific things within a company. And each of them have their own little data science pod as well. And that's really important because those data scientists in the spokes are very close to the action. They're very close to the place where the scientific questions are being generated. And our data scientists will partner with theirs to get the insights out of the data and help them to answer their questions. So it's a hub and spoke model of data science in R&D that we think is the one that's going to give us those wins. Yeah, so what are some examples? I've got a couple here, or maybe it's three. So the first one, again, there's a little bit of talk earlier around automation and when will be the first molecule that's completely developed by AI and it just goes straight into clinical trials. Well, actually, there's been some significant advances there. So just to sort of bring you into our world for a second, when we're synthesizing molecules, or at least how it's been done traditionally, is quite a lab-based, chemist-driven endeavor. So a chemist will find a way to synthesize a molecule. They'll put that molecule through a series of tests, which will tell us how potent it is, how soluble it is, how it's likely to be processed by the human body? How strongly is it going to bind? How stable is it? And we'll get the results of those, and we'll kind of say, it's not quite as good as it could be. So we'll tweak the design of that molecule. And then we'll go back round the loop again. And each pass round that loop can take weeks. We've found ways, piloted in certain cases, where you can sort of run that as a closed loop. And we've found machines, technologies, automation, and AI, which can speed round that cycle in hours instead of weeks. So a machine that can automatically synthesize the molecule for you, automatically applies the various assays, uses machine learning to analyze the results of those assays, and then automatically suggests the tweak in design to the molecule so that you can go back round the loop again. So that's really our goal, is how can we fully automate this so-called DMTA, design, make, test, analyze cycle. And that's right back at the start when we're doing the initial chemistry to create the drug. Just think if you could just really speed that up by a number of orders of magnitude. Incredibly exciting. And I'm going to show you one part of this on the next slide. And what you're going to see, I'm going to describe it now before you see it, because it's going to sort of go into an animation. But what you're going to see is a recurrent neural network constantly redesigning a molecule. And that recurrent neural network is operating in a reinforcement learning paradigm. So it's trying to maximize that score around the qualities of the molecule and try and make the best possible molecule it can. So let's see how it gets on. So here's the score on the bottom right. That's the vertical axis. And of course, the x-axis is the number of iterations. And as it's going forward, it's showing us the different molecular designs that it's trying out. And remember, all the time, it's trying to maximize this score. It's like playing Go or chess, right? Or a computer game where there's a single score to maximize. It knows what good looks like, but the neural network keeps going back and trying different things until it kind of maxes out. And we can see, obviously in this case, it's not going and running the assays and stuff. It's working purely with a design. And so there's a question before about capabilities in-house, buy versus build. This was an in-house thing, okay? This was our chemists and our data scientists, and the chemists becoming ever more expert in machine learning, and our data scientists learning ever more about chemistry, and coming together and figuring out how we could create a tool. We call it reinvent, because it reinvents the molecule, which is a neural network which speeds away and finds just the right design. And we've actually had our first example of a molecule that has been generated by this. No, it didn't go straight into clinical trials, but it came out of this process and went through the stage gate into the next part of R&D. And we're hoping to do that more and more going forward. So huge potential there. The next one, and I hope an obvious one, is imaging. I say it's obvious because it's kind of one of the most, at least outside of our field, it's like one of the most well-trammeled paths when it comes to exemplifying AI. And of course, that's shown on the left, whether you're trying to help an autonomous vehicle drive down a street, or you're trying to identify cats and dogs in images. We know that computers have the potential to do this so much better. So what's that on the right? This is a little biopsy tissue section from a tumor. And what we're interested in is the distribution of cells in that tumor. We want to understand what these cells are expressing, which ones are cancerous, which ones are normal, which ones represent activity of the immune system. So which ones are different kinds of immune cells. And the way this is typically done is very manual in the lab. A stain is produced so that some of the cells turn a slightly different color, and then a pathologist needs to look down a microscope and kind of figure out how many of each kind of cell have we got. Well, of course, now we have AI that can do this for us, and it can tell us exactly how many of each kind of cell we've got. And then, as we're developing drugs, we would then treat a patient or treat a piece of tissue, and then do this again, and see whether the drug is having the effect on the tumor that we would want it to have. The benefits are across the board. So, in short, the algorithms can help us analyze these images quicker, more accurately, more cheaply than a human pathologist can. And again, we're going to use this to help our human pathologists focus on what they should be doing, which is interpreting all this stuff. So we're putting together tools and dashboards, and this is kind of where it all comes together, right? Where you've got these AI-enhanced images, and now the pathologist, instead of spending hours looking down a microscope, can be concentrating on what they really should be doing, looking at this aggregate of annotated information driven by AI and making the right informed decisions about which medicines we take forward to the next phase of development. Oh, I pressed the wrong one. That was, okay. Final example is where we're using devices. And I think this, I said I wasn't going to talk about clinical trials. This is a clinical trial. I contradicted myself. So this is called iPredict. Again, you can read it for yourself, but I think what's getting really exciting now is sort of testing a number of different devices in the same context, that kind of mixture of active and passive sensing, hearing from the patient, but also taking measurements from them. So this is in respiratory disease. So in this clinical trial, they not only have an inhaler, which has a Bluetooth chip on it, but they also have home spirometry, where they can test lung function. They have a BioPatch, which measures skin temperature, heart rate, respiratory rate, activity, etc. And all of this goes to the phone, the iPhone, or whatever kind of smartphone it is, and can be uploaded to the cloud and can be analysed. And what my team's been doing is really figuring out how to make sense of all this, right? So this is, speaking of challenges and potential and pitfalls, this is a huge area to understand, right? When you get readouts from so many different devices, what's it really all telling you? So again, tremendously exciting in terms of starting to create that closed feedback loop via which patients can better manage their condition in the future, but a huge challenge for data scientists. Yeah, so potential and pitfalls. What I find funny about this is whenever somebody asks me about challenges and opportunities in this area, I end up talking about the same stuff on both sides. So you see that here. So I think one of the huge challenges with implementation of AI in this area is that to make the data AIsable, or as we call it, fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, if you've not come across it, similar concept, right? Analytics ready, is a huge amount of effort. On the other hand, we've got tons of data, so we don't have to tackle it all at once. I do think hype is a big problem, right? This area is completely and utterly oversold. But how fantastic for us data scientists and others wanting to implement this, that it's being talked about so much. You know, we couldn't have wished for more. Ethics, I think, is going to be a big stumbling block, and creating that wider conversation with the public about what this really means in terms of risks and opportunities going forward. But isn't it great that there's a spotlight on ethics? I'm sure I read some statistic the other day that said there's now 120 different sets of ethical guidelines for AI. Like suddenly everybody in the world, like every public association came up with one at the same time. It's a bit like, you know, ontological standards a few years ago. And I'm sure it'll converge at some point. But it's great that it's being talked about and it's a topic because it's really important. It's not just about data scientists doing this in a darkened room. It's about making sure it's part of a wider conversation so that the rest of the world understands the implications as well. So it depends whether your glass is half empty or half full, I would say. So what's next? A little bit of a look to the future. And while we do this, I can actually answer the question about collaboration. So this has come up a number of times today. People talking about partnerships. How do you partner? I can talk to you about how we do this. And these are some numbers about, this isn't all in AI, but various partnerships we've got and how many we've got in each region around the world. So we're a very collaborative company in that respect. But some of the partnerships we've got in the AI space are shown down here. And what I'll say about these is they're quite specific. So we don't go for the big, broad company A partners with big company B to do everything, partnerships. We go for quite specific ones. So we decided that in order to understand disease biology better, we needed to bring together all our disease information into interconnected knowledge graphs so that we can perform inference across those graphs to test our hypotheses and generate new ones. We found Benevolent, who are, well, we knew about them before, but we partnered with Benevolent because it turns out they're one of the best companies in the world, if not the best, at doing that kind of thing. We partner with Schrödinger because they have some great software and capabilities for predicting how strongly a molecule will bind to its target in the disease setting. So we generally come up with very specific problems we want to solve, and then we'll find the best company in the world for doing that, whether they've got 2 or 2,000 employees. So just to sort of say a little bit about what our strategy is there. And the other point I want to emphasize is it's rarely the AI that sells it. And somebody touched on this earlier. It's usually because that company either has access to data that we wouldn't otherwise have access to, they can access it in an interesting or smart way, so they've got processes or automation that we wouldn't otherwise have. They've got tools that are ready to go that kind of wrap around their algorithms, or they've got a really interesting way of kind of deploying it, like distributed AI where the data stays in place, for instance. It's rarely, and the first sell is always, we've got great AI, we've got great data scientists. Somebody who sits on our board was a top professor at this university. We built these models. Yeah, we can build models too. The conversation nearly always evolves to the real value add, and it's never where you start. It's never the AI algorithms. Not to say these companies aren't great at doing that as well. It's just not differentiating. So this isn't quite a shameless plug for We Are Hiring. I wanted to make a serious point here, which is, we are hiring, by the way. The serious point is that we are hiring. So in an era where you see companies, and pharma are no exception, downsizing in certain areas, shrinking, maybe budgets being cut, refocusing, this is a growth area. That is hugely clear. Okay, I'm going to finish there. Thank you for listening. Are we doing app or in-room questions?
So we have the questions up there if you want to pick a couple before lunch. Yeah.
Okay. Just a reminder there that I'm keeping everybody from lunch. Provocative question. Thank you, Charlie. Do you think we'll ever see Blackbox AI pharma in which the treatments work but are unable to explain exactly why they work? Well, we have that already. We already have a number of treatments which work well and make patients better, and we don't really understand how. So that wouldn't be new. But maybe to answer the spirit of the question, which is Blackbox AI, I think Blackbox AI is a bit of a red herring. I think there's plenty of things that we don't understand. You know, when people first started paying wirelessly with their phone, like there was maybe one person in 100 that did it, and I was one of them. And most of the people I spoke to, they're like, that's ridiculous, that's never safe, that's never secure, I'm not having my financial information pass over the air here. And yet, now we all do it, and nobody questions it. And I don't think that's because everybody suddenly understands what's happening inside one of these. It's because of social proof, it's because of trust, and it's because the technology's advanced to a sufficient place where we've gained that trust. So, by the way, I think there's some great tools these days for helping to explain what does go on inside an AI algorithm. I don't think it has to be a black box at all. But for those that are not going to be au fait with the mathematics of that, I don't know that they have to be. So I don't know that black boxes in AI are actually hugely different than black boxes anywhere, like not understanding why some of our drugs actually do what they do. Are any of you using AI to improve the efficiencies of your clinical trials? Yes, absolutely. Speak to Faisal in the break. What are your thoughts on use of a common tool data model like OMOP to help run machine learning or deep learning algorithms remotely from a granularity or governance perspective? Hugely important, I think. So what we've done in the real world space, for instance, is actually use OMOP to kind of map a lot of our real world data sources too, which then enables us to put common analytics and tools over the top. What are your thoughts on using NLP or OCR automation to help mine unstructured documentation? I think you have to pick your use cases carefully. I think you have to understand what you're trying to answer. You can help it's useful for getting things like extra granularity on diagnostic information from clinicians' notes, for instance. I think that can be useful. And OCR, I see OCR as a matter of necessity born out of the fact that we still haven't quite gone paperless yet. So hopefully when we do, we don't need OCR so much. Are you aware that Flinders University in Australia developed a new vaccine, bleed to bear? No, I'd love to hear more about that. So I'll have to speak to Dale in the break. Is that all the questions? Okay. Cool, thanks for those.